Greetings all, Ferrari Man 601 here. Welcome back to iRacing, and welcome to, of all places, Charlotte Motor Speedway. Yes, we're going to be running the Roval today. I've been on a Roval kick lately. I only learned this place a few days ago as of the time of recording this, and it has somehow, against all odds, sucked me in. It's a silly little track. It's just a road course built mostly into the infield of Charlotte Motor Speedway, which of course is an oval. However, it's quite dynamic, and it's quite fun, and it's actually a pretty fun place to throw an open wheeler around. So why are we here, and why are we looking at a totally white race car? Well, this car has been featured in quite a few of my videos to date, and I have absolutely fallen in love with it, but I've never really talked at length about it, so I'm going to put that right today. This, for your viewing pleasure, is the Formula Renault 3.5 car, officially known as the Dallara T12. This was the car that was built for the Formula Renault 3.5 series, also known as the Renault World Series, also known as the World Series by Renault, which is now a defunct racing series. Went defunct, I believe, for the 2018 or 2019 season. Not quite sure on that, but all I know is that as of 2019, this series is not happening, and it is a great shame because the cars that raced in that series were pretty cool, and of course, it's this one that we see before us. I want to talk about this one. I wanted to give it a full-on review because it has become one of my favorites in iRacing, despite it no longer featuring in any real-world official sanctioned competition. The Dallara T12, what is it? Well, it is the car that was built for the Renault World Series. It's constructed by Dallara, yes, the very famous Italian manufacturer, building, among other things, the IR18 for IndyCar, as well as the DW12 and IR05 chassis that preceded that car in that series. Also, they are building Formula One cars for Haas presently. In the past, they have also built Formula One cars for other constructors, Hispania in recent years, and Dallara themselves even had a full factory Formula One team at one point in the early 90s. So a lot of pedigree for Dallara. Of course, they also built different kinds of race cars, mostly single-seaters. They have built Le Mans prototypes and things like that, so they've got a lot of experience. But nowadays, Dallara, for the most part, they have their experience very focused on single-seat, open-cockpit, open-wheeled cars, and this, of course, is a fine example of that. The T12, it was introduced into the Renault World Series for 2011, and it continued to race all the way up to the last time that championship ever saw competition. It was designed in principle by Luca Pignaca and Andrea Tosso, also working for Dallara there. The car's immediate predecessor was the Dallara T8. Similar to this, but some improvements on this one here. What you see before you, it looks very familiar. It looks very similar to a Formula One car of, say, 2005 to 2008 vintage. Well, that's because it does share many of its design traits with cars of that era in Formula One. The chassis, it's all carbon fiber construction. It's a carbon fiber monocoque in there, built basically to the same specifications of a mid-2000s Formula One car. It's, of course, that carbon monocoque with the cockpit, with the survival cell in there, making the structural core of the car. And, of course, the driver sits right in the middle of all of that, cocooned in there with a whole bunch of safety features. Front and rear suspension on this thing, double wishbone, push rod, front and rear. You can see the push rods and wishbones there on the front end of this car, very similar to what we still see in Formula One today. And as for the rear, very similar to what we saw in Formula One basically up until the early 2010s. Dimensions on this thing. The length is 5,070 millimeters, or exactly 200 inches. The width is 1,930 millimeters, or 76 inches. The height, 1,050 millimeters, or 41 inches. So in terms of the overall dimensions, we're slightly smaller width-wise than a current Formula One car, which is bang on 2,000 millimeters. Length-wise, well, we are quite a bit shorter. The Mercedes W10 in 2019, they're at close to 8,000 millimeters. I think 8 meters there is more or less the length of that car. So much shorter, but it makes the car a lot more exciting to drive. They don't sort of swing around with that big pendulum effect like you see in modern Formula One cars. These things are very zippy, very nimble, and very twitchy, as I'm sure we will see moving forward. The axle track there, as we can see, the front axle is 1,630 millimeters or 64 inches. The rear axle slightly narrower, 1,530 millimeters or 60 inches. The wheelbase, 3,125 mil or 123 inches. So dimensionally, it's actually quite similar to the IR18 and DW12 cars that Dallara also built, in this case for the IndyCar series. The engine. You may be wondering why we call it the Formula Renault 3.5. Well, this is why. The engine in this thing is a Zytec Renault, the specification ZRS03. It's actually not quite 3.4 liters in its displacement. 3,396 cubic centimeters is the specific displacement on that engine. That's 207 cubic inches in old money. It's a V8 with a 90-degree bank angle. It's normally aspirated, and it is mid-mounted just behind the fuel tank, longitudinally as a stressed member in the construction. So in terms of the overall macrocosmic design of this thing, it is a Formula One car. The transmission, it is a Ricardo-designed 6-speed sequential semi-automatic actuation there. It's got paddles on the back of the steering wheel, 6 forward gears, 1 reverse, and a neutral, theoretically, in between all 7 of those drive gears. We're putting out about 530 horsepower from this engine, so it really doesn't seem like it's all that much in comparison to, say, IndyCar putting out close to 800 horsepower, or Formula One, which, who knows, the stratosphere is really the limit there. Well in excess of 1,000 horsepower in 2019 coming out of the class-leading Formula One engines. But 530 horsepower in this. And when you consider that this car weighs 1,358 pounds or 616 kilograms, that's excluding the driver, by the way, that goes up to a maximum of 691 kilos or 1,523 pounds with the driver. So obviously you can get some human body weight features in there if you really want to. Smaller guys are going to have a weight advantage, of course. But you realize that the power to weight in this thing is still well above something like a Formula 3, certainly a Formula 4. We're really approaching Formula 2 levels of overall performance in terms of engine power to chassis weight here. So it's really, really cool. You'll also notice on this car we don't have halo, as we see on basically every open-wheeler nowadays, some variation of the halo system, whether or not it's a strict halo, as we see in Formula 1, Formula 2, Formula 3, and even the Formula 4 guys are getting into halo, or the aero screen that IndyCar is going for the 2020 season and beyond. This car, a truly open cockpit, and it's very much a member of that endangered species nowadays. This being a spec series, of course, the fuel and lubricants all provided by the same manufacturer, so that's ELF for both categories. The tires were Michelin slicks, as you can see here, for dry running. They ran on OZ Racing wheels. Over this car's total competition lifespan in the Formula Renault World Series, it had 90 races, and considering it was the only car that was allowed to run in that series, it won all 90 of those races, and it took 4 championships by default, simply because it had no real competition. But that's the nitty-gritty technical specifications on this car. What's really of our interest, though, is to pop inside the thing and just take a look at what it does. We're going to put some fuel on board here. We will jump into the cockpit and we'll go through what we see in here. Well, here with the ignition switched off, you can start to get a sense of the overall proportions going on in here. We've got our 2 mirrors on either side of the cockpit, as you would expect to see. We've got our very fancy steering wheels we can see there. Just a rectangular wheel, no continuous rim on it. There's no need for that, of course, because the steering rack on this is quite quick, as you would imagine. You can see the paddles there on the back. And the view out of this thing, well, it's an open wheeler. Sans halo, of course. Just see the tops of your front wheels there. And that's about it. In terms of what's directly in front of you, it's all a mystery. So you better have your eyes looking well down the racetrack. We switch the car on, and you see what comes up in terms of instrumentation. We do have that fancy LCD right front and center on the steering wheel, and right now it's telling me that I have no oil pressure, which is not at all surprising considering the engine's not running. However, down below that, you will see that we have got ourselves a lap time down there, which is not showing anything that makes sense right now. We fire the engine up, we'll get some more details here. So with the engine on, we can see that we have one page of our display here. Obviously, front and center, neutral, that's our gearbox. Lets us know what the gearbox is doing. There's our 6 forward gears. come down through neutral and reverse, and hopefully we won't have to be using reverse too much. Over on the left center side of that display, we have our tachometer ticking past 2441 right now. So that's our crankshaft RPM. Below that, we will have a speed readout in miles per hour here. In the middle right of the steering wheel, we have a DRS counter. Yes, this car has some toys for us to play with. One of those toys is DRS. It works a little bit differently than DRS does in, say, Formula One, but it is a drag reduction system, and it does work on the rear wing. Below that, the green 00 decibel 01 decibel 000, that is our last lap time, and then our current lap time will be there where you see that 640 going past. In the extreme lower right of the steering wheel, you see that green rectangle there. That is going to show us when DRS is active, in addition to that DRS counter that we'll see become active once we get underway. You see it's green right now. That'll turn blue when I'm actually on DRS. Page 2 of this display that shows us the same information for the most part, but in a little bit larger print so we can see it a little bit better. The only difference is we have water temperature in the left-hand side there at 156 Fahrenheit, and then we have oil pressure, I believe that is, down below there. The tachometer has moved into the upper right. You'll also see 2 more readouts on that steering wheel there on either page. They remain in the top line of that display. One is about another one of the toys that we can play with on this car. We have a launch limit. Now, what that is, it's not a launch map in that it doesn't change anything that the engine is doing when we change that parameter. But what it does do is it acts as a rev limiter so that we can set in an RPM and then just floor the throttle and then not exceed that RPM. So it's very effective on launches for standing starts coming out of the pit lane or at the race start. We'll demonstrate how that works. In order to engage the launch limit, you have to assign a button on your steering wheel to do it. So I'll flip a switch, and now you can see launch limit on. So now I can floor the throttle, and it will not exceed that preset RPM, which appears to be 6241 at this particular launch limit. If I go into launch limit 2, activate it, and then floor the throttle, that then revs to 6740, and so on and so forth as we go up through the launch limit. If I cycle through it from 1 to 6 in the 6 different parameters we have, as I'm flooring the throttle, you hear the revs go up. So you can see the effect there. For the most part, those are all the toys that we have to play with in this car. The rest of it, pretty simple and pretty standard in terms of what you'd expect to see in a modern open-wheeler. Semi-automatic box, up on the right, down on the left, as easy as you like. iRacing's new clutch physics that they've brought in the last couple of updates definitely have brought a lot of cars to life. This is one of them. This does not have any auto clutch in it in terms of when you're pulling away or coming to a stop, so you do have to know what you're doing with the clutch. And again, that's where the launch limit can really come into play, especially coming out of the pit lane or with a standing start situation. In addition to that, we also have a pit lane speed limiter here. The pit lane speed limit is 40 miles per hour, so it'll just by default hold you to that 40 miles an hour. Without any further ado, though, let's just get out on track and see what this thing does. So there we are. Final page here, the steering wheel. This is more just a diagnostic page to show you what's going on here. I've got an amp meter there showing 12 volts on the electrical system coming out of the alternator, fuel pressure, oil pressure, things like that. Throttle and brake percentage going on in the bottom there. Don't really spend a whole lot of time looking at this page, only if you're dealing with some system problems. But nonetheless, we'll punch up the limiter, we'll punch up the launch limit, and we'll come out of the pits. Drop the clutch. Off you go, easy as you like. Now, in terms of how this launch limit works, well, we pulled away and you saw that. However, if I forget to turn it off, what happens? Car will not exceed, in this case, 49 miles per hour because that's just where the rev limiter is. 2 ways to deactivate the launch limit. Either you hit the same button that you assigned to it in the first place, that will turn it on and off, or if you're really incompetent and you forget which switch you set, The moment you go up into second gear, launch limit goes away, and now you can see we have a complete rev range available to us. Sitting in the pit lane as long as we were, the tire temperatures have completely gone away, so we'll be careful on these first couple of laps. It's an open wheeler, of course, so we've got carbon brakes, so we got to think about the brake temperatures, and of course we got to think about the tire temperatures. See shift light starting to come up in the top row of the steering wheel there. Rev limit on the engine is about 9,000 RPM. You see getting right up to red line there. It's very, very deliberately getting everything up to temperature. Want to make sure the car is going to be happy. While we're waiting for everything to get up to its operating range, have a look at this track. It's absolutely nuts. It's the Roval. It's a Charlotte Motor Speedway, but NASCAR thought it would be a cool idea to have a road course in the middle of an oval like that, and of course that's nothing new. Many oval tracks around the world have multiple configurations, many of which feature a road course to some degree. This, though, I think it's a somewhat new breed of road courses in how compact it is. And it does still use pretty much the entire extent of the oval. The only thing it really doesn't use is a little tri-oval section here in the middle on start-finish, replaced by this chicane. But really, it works pretty well, in my opinion. And of course, the NASCAR events here have been absolutely crazy because you've got a 3,500-pound stock car with a 4-speed gearbox and, comparatively speaking, very small tires. And those cars are only good at turning left. So when you get a road course situation with something like that, sparks fly, quite literally. The other reason for me wanting to do something like this on the Roval is because Joseph Newgarden, the 2019 IndyCar champion, did an exhibition run here before the NASCAR race. And I've got to say, it looked oh so cool to see the IR-18 running around here at some pretty good speed. So I figure, why not bring that to you on the channel? Starting to get a little bit of confidence now in the tires. The brakes feel all right. Start to press on with the speed here. There we go. Just a little breath off the throttle there coming into the last portion of the infield. Actually, there's quite a lot of elevation change in these last couple of corners. It'll really grab your attention. And now watch that green box in the lower right of the display. It's green. Now it is blue. I am using the DRS. The DRS on this car works a little bit differently than it does in Formula 1 or Formula 2. Rather than opening up the main plane of that rear wing basically as a big flap, what it actually does is it deploys a little bit of a spoiler underneath the main plane of the rear wing on this car. And later on at the end of the video, when I've got hot laps from the external cameras, you'll be able to see when I'm using DRS. You'll just see the slot gap below the main plane on the rear wing close up, and what that does is it's actually stalling the rear wing. So rather than physically moving the main plane out of the way and streamlining everything, it's actually throwing a little bit of aerodynamic interference in its way so that it somewhat negates the effect of that rear wing without having to move it very much. This saves complexity and, of course, saves cost in a spec series like this where you want it to be reasonably accessible to all the competitors. The effect of that DRS, though, because it works a little bit differently than perhaps what you're used to, it doesn't quite have the same sort of impact that it does on a Formula One car. For example, the straight line speed increase is not that dramatic. However, the impact on rear downforce is not all that dramatic either. So you can open this thing up in the middle of a corner and it will not unsettle the car too severely. The other thing about how the DRS works is, unlike, again, on some other cars that you might be used to, the DRS is not tied to the brake pedal. It's actually tied to the throttle. The DRS only activates if you're at full throttle. The instant you lift off the throttle, even if it's just a little bit, the DRS deactivates and the slot gap opens up again and you regain the effectiveness of your rear wing. So that takes a little bit of getting used to if you're used to the DRS only being impacted by either you pushing the button again or by you getting on the brake. In terms of what this car feels like to drive, well, the gearbox is an absolute peach. It is far from seamless in terms of the upshifts there. You do get a very marked power cut as you're swapping cogs there. You do get an auto blip on the downshift, which is quite welcome. And, of course, pretty much standard fare in a modern open-wheeler or a modern semi-auto car of any variety. The brakes, once they're up to temperature, they're carbon-carbon brakes, so of course they're going to be really good, and they are. Force feedback, though, is something I really like in this car. This car does not have power steering, so in that vein it's very similar to the IR18. Not at all similar to a Formula One car, which does have power steering, of course, nowadays. So you do get a lot of positive feedback through the steering. And depending on what gear you're using, in terms of your wheel and your rig equipment, you're going to feel that to varying degrees, and it really does help you understand what's going on with the car. It's very communicative. There are the brakes, very good, of course. In terms of the tires and chassis, well, spec tires, everybody ran the same compound, same specification, so they're pretty hard. But when you do get them up to temperature, of course, they're big slicks. They do have a lot of grip. Wheel spin is not really something you worry about so much. Through there, able to get back on the power really quickly and not worry so much. In terms of the chassis, though, at speed, you definitely feel the downforce. Of course, we've got big front and rear wings on this car. In addition to that, we do have some tunnels in the undertray, so we do have a little bit of ground effect starting to come into play at higher speeds. It's a rather crude ground effect. It's not something that you would really compare to, say, the Lotus 79, but it is there, and at higher speed, you do notice it. Medium and low speed stuff, the car's actually pretty compliant. It's pretty neutral. Of course, it's very stiff, but it doesn't bounce around so much. Even if you really start to throttle it over the curbs, it's pretty compliant. Gets some resonant vibrations coming across the front axle there over the banking at higher speed, but just turning it into the curbing like this, it doesn't bounce so much. The car does want to return to a happy neutral state, which overall means it is a very stable platform for you to start building consistency. See our live delta going on there at the bottom of the steering wheel. It's also quite useful. Shows you what's going on in real time, so you know where you're quicker, where you're losing time. So we gained a little bit of time through that chicane there on the backstretch. Had a little understeer on the exit. If we can gain some more through here. A little bit. 106, I'll be happy with that. And you can see now that we've got a handful of laps under our belt, the tires are really up to temperature, the brakes are happy, the confidence starts to build. Ah, yeah, not too much more of that, thank you. Starting to want to push the braking into this chicane. You can see our top speed here, about 160 miles an hour or so, a little bit more. In terms of trying to place this car and its overall level of performance in context with the other open wheelers that we've got in iRacing, I'd place it squarely between the IR18 and the Formula 3 car. It's a lot quicker than Formula 3. It's got a lot more horsepower. It's got a lot more downforce. And in terms of the IR18, it's actually developing most of its grip in very similar ways. The IR18 has about 200 more horsepower than this does, but it's also got big front and rear wings, and it's also got a significant amount of underbody aero going on. So this is actually a very nice analog to the IR18, and in a couple of hot lap comparisons that I've already done featuring this car and the IR18, depending on the track, they can actually do laps within 1 second of each other. In terms of overall open-wheeler context, if you remember the first couple of years of the GP2 championship, now of course called Formula 2, that first generation GP2 car, 2005, 2006, this is very similar to that. Just taking a look through the displays, doing some housekeeping. Water temp looks good, oil temp looks good, fuel pressure's good. So we've got enough fuel in the tank. And as you can see, she's pretty content to do 106s around here all day. Very stable at speed. Even under heavy braking, it's very stable, very compliant, very predictable. Also really love that engine. Yeah, it's a V8. It's a reasonably big V8 as well. But it's still revving at 9,000 RPM. And it's naturally aspirated. So it doesn't have really peaky power. It's not at all like a turbo engine or even really like a Formula 1 engine, be it the V6s or the older V8s. It's very, very tractable. Most of the power is at the top end, yes, but it's got decent torque all through the working range. So basically from about 6,000 up to 9,000, where the engine is happiest, and it's got a lot of usable power throughout that whole rev range. You can get on the throttle pretty early out of a corner and not get too much wheel spin, if any at all. And of course it sounds quite nice as well. Car just absolutely wants to suck you in. It's almost effortless. It's great. It's doing pretty much everything I want. Not too many things that I don't want. It's just a stable platform. It really is. You can see why a series that's designed for younger drivers, some up-and-coming talents, would choose something like this. It is so compliant. It's so predictable. Is it easy to drive? Not really. I mean, you need to know what you're doing. You need to have experience in cars like this. But certainly if you've driven the Formula 3, the IR18, DW12, or even the IR05, you know exactly what you're getting into with something like this. Doesn't have anywhere near the performance potential of the Formula 1 cars in iRacing, so the FW31 or MP430. But for what it is, and it actually is quite a lot. I mean, again, 530 horsepower is nothing to sneeze at. It does get up and going pretty quick. It is definitely, absolutely wonderful. That's why I featured it so much. I just can't help but keep driving this thing whenever I'm in it. It's absolutely great. It is so rewarding. Makes you feel like a hero, even though you're really not. It just does what I want. Marvelous. Absolutely marvelous. Yeah, we're going to be running out of gas. Too bad. But I think we've been doing 106s since we started this fast run. It's a consistency generator. It's so much fun. So responsive, so communicative. No matter what you're doing in this thing, it's going to be a nice time. We'll dive off into the pits here.
You have about 1 lap of fuel left.
And there she is. Formula Renault 3.5 Dallara T12, whatever you want to call it. There it is. It is an absolutely wonderful little car. A little burnt out star, perhaps you could call this thing, because unfortunately nobody races this anymore. But for what it is, it's absolutely great. I mean, no, it's not the fastest thing that you're ever going to see, and it's certainly not the most well-known thing that you're ever going to see. For the most part, it's built on 2000s era technology. I mean, you know, we've got ourselves basically the GP2 car from 2005. But for what it is, it's brilliant. I really have nothing to criticize at all about this car. It's just, it has a lot of performance potential, yet it's accessible to the point where you're not killing yourself every time you want to drive it. Something like the IR18 or DW12, I mean, that car also doesn't have power steering. It's also got a lot of power and not all that much weight, but those cars are more on the knife edge in terms of what they can and can't do. And if you know what they can do, then you can exploit them. But if you don't know what they can do, you're going to find where the limit is. And then when you get to that limit, it's just going to be off into the catch fence. So something like this, it's much more accessible, but the performance is still there. And again, when you really do string this thing out, it is within 1 second of the IR18 on a lot of tracks. So that's really cool to see. Obviously, something like this not designed to run on an oval, so you won't be running with the IR18 on an oval. But, you know, the short road courses, like some place like here, or a place like Zolder, for example, or even Laguna Seca, depending on how you've got it trimmed out, it can definitely compete with cars that are well above its weight class. So definitely, this is a cool one. Certainly, it is something that if you haven't driven, and it's been in iRacing now for a number of months, definitely it is something that you should take some time to check out because it's a lot of fun, and it's become really one of my favorite cars in all of sim racing, not just iRacing. I mean, when they brought it into iRacing, I was a little skeptical, to be honest, because I knew that this series was no longer, and honestly, I was very skeptical, thinking, okay, why have they bothered to waste all of that time just trying to, you know, to create a car for a series that nobody's in. But you know, there's a time and place for everything, and I think iRacing definitely did it right, bringing us this car when they did, because, well, it's really cool, and again, it is one of my favorites. It's absolutely wonderful to see, and I'm glad that we've got it, because it's a lot of fun. I leave you with a look at some hot laps in this car from external as well as the onboard roll bar camera there. So please do stay tuned for all of that. Until next time, though, I do hope you all enjoyed this. Ferrari Man 601 saying thank you very much for watching. And, of course, we will see you soon.